The fluorescent lights inside the Billings County Courthouse hummed with that particular frequency that gets under a man's skin. Not loud, not sharp, just constant. The kind of sound that reminds you the world keeps moving whether you want it to or not. Garrett Lowe sat in the second row of the gallery, spine straight, jaw set, hands folded on his knees, the way a man learns to sit when he has spent years waiting for orders in places where the wrong move gets people killed. He was 38 years old. He looked older in the way that certain men do. Not from weakness, from weight. The kind of weight that settles into the lines around a man's eyes when he has seen things he cannot unsee and carried them alone long enough that they become part of his face. The courtroom smelled of old wood and floor wax and the faint chemical trace of someone's cologne sitting 2 rows ahead. Garrett noticed these things without meaning to. Situational awareness. 12 years of Navy SEAL training had rewired his brain in ways that could not be undone. He noticed the exit doors. He noticed the loose hinge on the gallery railing. He noticed the way Preston Aldridge kept his shoulders deliberately relaxed, the performance of a man who wants to appear at ease because he knows he has already won. Preston sat across the aisle in a charcoal suit that cost more than most men in Billings made in a month. He was 47 years old, broad through the jaw, silver at the temples in the way that reads as distinguished rather than aged. He had the posture of a man who had spent his career in courtrooms and learned that stillness communicates power. Beside him sat Sylvia, his sister, 44, her dark hair pulled back tight, her expression arranged into something that resembled patience, but was really just contempt wearing a mask. Neither of them looked at Garrett. That was deliberate, too. Garrett had not spoken to either of them in 6 years. The last time had been at a family gathering in Livingston that he had attended only because his grandmother had asked him to come. Margaret Lowe had been 71 that summer, still sharp, still fierce in the quiet way of women who have survived long enough to stop explaining themselves. She had pulled Garrett aside near the back porch and held his hand in both of hers and said something he had never forgotten. She had said, "They will try to take what is not theirs when I am gone. You remember that I told you so." He had thought she meant the house in Livingston, the old Lowe property on the edge of town with the split rail fence and the cottonwood trees that drop gold leaves every October. Like they were doing it on purpose. He had not understood then what she really meant. He understood now. Judge Harold Fenwick entered from the side door and the room gathered itself into formal silence. Fenwick was in his late 60s, deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who took the weight of his position seriously because he had held it long enough to know that courtrooms change lives and that changing a life was not something to rush. Garrett had filed no objection to the probate proceeding. He had no grounds. The will had been submitted, the signatures had been notarized, the documents were in order. Ruth Bancroft had told him as much 2 weeks ago when she called him out of the blue, a woman he did not know calling from a law office in Helena, telling him to attend the reading of Margaret Lowe's will and to wait afterward. She had been careful with her words. She had not told him why. She had only said that there were things he needed to understand that could not be explained over the phone. He had driven down from the property he rented outside of Laurel, loaded Rex into the back seat, and made the 2-hour drive in the kind of cold that settles over Montana in late November, like the state itself has decided to stop tolerating visitors. Rex was in the truck now. Garrett had cracked the windows and left the engine running with the heat on low. Rex would be fine. Rex was always fine. The dog had survived things that would have broken most living creatures, and he had come through them with the same steady, amber-eyed calm he brought to everything. Garrett sometimes thought that Rex had a better grip on the nature of the world than most men he had served with. Judge Fenwick opened the documents and began to read. The Lowe family estate, the Livingston property, the investment accounts, the savings, everything that Margaret Lowe had spent a lifetime accumulating through careful living and quiet discipline. The judge read the names of the beneficiaries in the flat, uninflected tone of a man delivering information rather than judgment, though in this room the two were the same thing. Preston Aldridge, your primary beneficiary, the Livingston property in full, Sylvia Aldridge, and secondary beneficiary, the investment portfolio, the remaining accounts, various charitable distributions as specified in the attached schedule. Garrett Lowe, the judge paused. There is no designated inheritance. 4 words. Flat as the eastern Montana plains. No explanation attached. No codicil. No note of acknowledgement. Not even his name mentioned twice. Just the fact of his exclusion delivered in the same tone as everything else, as though it were unremarkable, as though a man could be written out of his own grandmother's final word without it meaning anything at all. Across the aisle, Preston turned his head just slightly, not enough to make eye contact, just enough to let Garrett see the corner of his mouth move. Sylvia looked at her phone. Garrett breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, something a therapist had taught him years ago that he had never used until he left the service, and then had used every day. He kept his hands still on his knees. He kept his face neutral. He had learned long ago that giving people a reaction was giving them something they had not earned. The judge moved on to administrative matters. Garrett stood slowly, the chair scraping the floor with a sound that felt louder than it was, and walked to the double doors at the back of the gallery. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke to him. He pushed through the doors and into the corridor and let them swing shut behind him. The hallway was quieter, long and institutional, and lit by overhead panels that gave everything a faint yellowish cast. Garrett walked to the end of the corridor and stood near the tall window that looked out over the parking lot. Snow was beginning, small flakes almost tentative, drifting sideways in the wind. The sky above the building line was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, and making promises about what the night would bring. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about her hands, rough at the knuckles, strong through the fingers, the hands of a woman who had never been given anything and had stopped expecting to be. She had grown up during a time when Montana winters were not a metaphor, but a condition of survival, and she had carried that understanding into every decade of her life. She was not sentimental. She was not soft, but she had loved Garrett in the direct, unsentimental way of people who love through action rather than declaration, and he had known it, and it had been enough. He did not hear the door open behind him. "Excuse me?" The voice was a woman's, measured, a little breathless, as though she had moved quickly to catch him. "Mr. Lowe." Garrett Lowe. He turned. She was in her late 50s. Silver hair, practical cut, a wool coat the color of pine bark. She carried a leather briefcase with both hands, and she was looking at him with the expression of a person who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is suddenly uncertain whether the rehearsal was enough. "I am Ruth Bancroft," she said. "We spoke on the phone." He recognized the name. He studied her for a moment the way he studied everything, reading for threat, reading for intention, finding neither. "You said to wait," he said. "I did." She shifted the briefcase slightly. "I apologize for the circumstances. I know what just happened in there." "You knew it was going to happen. It was not a question." She heard that and nodded. "Yes," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore knew it as well. She told me it would go exactly this way." The name landed differently than he expected. Whitmore. He had heard it exactly once in his life from his grandmother in a conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes. A name spoken carefully, the way people speak names that carry old grief in them. "Edna Whitmore," Ruth said, reaching into her briefcase and withdrawing an envelope. "Your grandmother's older sister. She asked me to give you this today. Specifically today, after the reading." The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, sealed with dark red wax impressed with a small pine tree. His name was written across the front in handwriting that was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship when it was still considered a discipline worth mastering. Garrett held it without opening it. "Edna Whitmore passed away 14 months ago," Ruth said, "but she spent the last years of her life making certain that this moment was prepared for. She was very specific about timing." "She passed away," Garrett said. "The family said she died in 1996. Ruth met his eyes steadily. The family, she said, was told what she wanted them to believe. The courthouse hallway was quiet around them. From somewhere behind the gallery doors came the muffled formality of the judge wrapping up the administrative portion of the proceeding. Garrett heard Preston's voice, smooth and professional, saying something that drew a brief murmur of acknowledgement from the court. The sound of a man who knows the room is his. Garrett broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was written on the same heavy cream stock, 3 pages in the same precise hand. He read it standing at the window with the snow beginning to thicken outside. She had opened with his name. Not "Dear Garrett," just Garrett, as though they were continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. She wrote, "If you are holding this, then it has gone exactly as I feared it would. Our family has a long history of calling things by the wrong names. They call cruelty practicality. They called greed inheritance. They called my leaving a scandal. I called it survival. What they did to me in 1977, I will not detail here because the details are not the point. The point is that I left and I built something they could not reach, and I spent a great deal of years deciding who deserved to inherit it. I have watched you, Garrett, from a distance and through means I will explain later. I watched you serve. I watched you come home. I watched you carry the weight of that homecoming without asking anyone to carry it with you. That kind of strength is not common. I have known men who had medals and no character, and I have known men with nothing on their record who had more honor than entire rooms full of decorated officers. You are the second kind. Your grandmother knew it. She told me so herself more times than you would believe. I am leaving you something I built from nothing. The North Ridge Estate, 480 acres in the Timber Ridge Mountains. A house, land, and what rests inside the house, which is more than you know. She left the next line on its own. Trust the dog. He will show you what matters. The letter continued with directions and a key tucked behind the final page. Small brass old stamped with a tiny pine tree that matched the wax seal. She had written a description of the property, a gate code, and a phrase he read twice before he understood it. She had written, "The truth in this house lives above its heart. You will know it when Rex finds it." He did not know how she knew the dog's name. He stood at the window for a long moment after he finished reading. Ruth waited beside him without speaking. She understood apparently that this was not a moment for commentary. Outside, the snow was coming harder now. The parking lot below had taken on a thin white skin. Garrett could see his truck near the far end of the lot, the engine idling, the faint distortion of heat above the exhaust. Through the back window, he could make out the dark shape of Rex sitting upright, watching the courthouse entrance, with the patient focus of an animal that has learned to wait without anxiety because it trusts that the person it is waiting for will return. He had driven into the parking lot 3 hours ago, thinking he was attending a formality. He was driving out of it, heading towards something he did not yet have the frame for. He folded the letter back into the envelope and put it inside his jacket. "Thank you," he said to Ruth Bancroft. She nodded. "There is more," she said, "but it cannot come from me. It has to come from the house." He drove north. The highway out of Billings moved through flat farmland, first the kind of country that is beautiful in summer and unforgiving in every other season. By the time he reached the foothills, the snow was consistent and the wind had picked up enough to push the truck sideways on the exposed stretches of road. Garrett corrected for it without thinking, the adjustments automatic and small, the muscle memory of a man who had driven in worse conditions than this. Rex rode in the back seat. He did not pace. He did not whine. He sat with his nose angled toward the window, reading the air that came through the gap at the top with the focused attention of a professional doing his job. Every so often, he would shift his weight and resettle, and once he rested his chin briefly on Garrett's shoulder before pulling back, a gesture so brief it could have been imagined. Garrett had gotten Rex through the Veterans Affairs K-9 program in 2018. He had not wanted a dog. He had lived alone for 2 years after leaving the service in a series of rentals that got progressively smaller as he moved from city to city, looking for whatever it was that felt like solid ground. He had not found it. He had found instead that the skills that made him exceptional in a combat environment made ordinary civilian life feel like walking through rooms designed for someone else's body. Everything was too small and too loud and too fast, and none of it made sense in the way that a mission makes sense, with clear objectives and clear enemies, and a team that would die for you because you would die for them. The VA counselor who processed his application had been matter-of-fact about the program. She had not oversold it. She had said some veterans find that the structure of caring for an animal gives the day a shape it otherwise lacks. She had said some find that the animal itself provides a kind of companionship that doesn't require explanation. She had said the dog they are assigning to him has an unusual history. He had been through a great deal. He will require a patient handler. The dog's name in the program files was Unit R-17. Garrett had started calling him Rex on the second day because R-17 was not a name, it was a designation, and whatever this dog had been through, he deserved a name. Rex had repaid the courtesy many times over. The drive north took 2 hours on summer roads. Tonight it took nearly 4. The mountains came up out of the dark, slowly the way they always do in Montana, revealing themselves in stages, first as shapes against the sky, and then as presence, and then as walls. Garrett had driven into the Timber Ridge Range before years ago on a hunting trip that had not gone particularly well, and he remembered the way the terrain changed, the valley giving way to switchbacks, and the switchbacks giving way to old-growth forest so dense the headlights seemed to stop at the tree line. He found the gate by the letter's directions. It stood at the end of an unmarked access road that split from a county route Garrett would not have noticed if he hadn't been looking. The gate itself was iron ornate in an old-fashioned way, heavy with accumulated rust, but still standing. A stone wall ran from each post into the tree line. A sign half buried in the accumulated drift read Whitmore Estate in letters that had once been carved deep enough to survive decades. He entered the gate code from the letter. The mechanism was electric, hidden somewhere inside one of the stone pillars, and it groaned with the reluctance of machinery that is asked to do something after a long rest. But it opened. The private road beyond was not plowed. Garrett drove through snow that reached the running boards in the deeper drifts, the truck grinding forward in four-wheel, low the tires searching for the road beneath the white. He could feel the edge of the road sometimes, and sometimes couldn't. And he navigated by the trees, staying centered between the wall of forest on each side, moving slowly enough that a mistake could be corrected. Rex came alert. It happened suddenly and completely. One moment the dog was riding with his characteristic ease, settled and calm, and the next he was rigid, head up, ears forward, a low sound building in his chest. Not a growl of fear, a growl of warning, the kind Rex made when something was wrong and Garrett was about to miss it. Garrett hit the brakes. The truck stopped 6 feet from a place where the road simply disappeared. The headlights showed it clearly now that he was close enough. The road curved left. He had been drifting right, in the dark and the snow with the trees looking the same on both sides. He had been 2 seconds from driving off the shoulder into a drop he could not measure from here, but which the sound of the wind coming up from it suggested was significant. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and the engine running and the snow coming at the windshield in sheets. "Good boy," he said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Rex settled back his job, done his manner entirely matter of fact. Garrett followed the correct curve and continued. The mansion appeared without warning. One moment there was only forest and snow and the tunnel of the headlights, and then the trees fell back on both sides and the structure was there. 3 stories. Stone walls the color of dark granite streaked white where the snow clung to the ledges and corners. A roof line complicated by gables and dormers buried under accumulated drift. Wraparound balconies on the second floor, their railings barely visible under the ice. Tall windows black and lightless. A covered entrance with pillars that had been carved with enough detail that someone at some point had meant this place to be beautiful. It was not beautiful now. It was immense and dark and absolutely still, the way a place gets when nothing living has moved through it for a long time. Garrett turned off the engine. The silence that followed was the deep kind. Storm silence. The blizzard was still moving through the mountains, wind pressing at the truck's snow, hissing against the glass. But inside the cab, the world had contracted to the sound of his own breathing and the faint shift of Rex adjusting his weight beside him. He looked at the house for a long moment. Then he opened the door. The cold hit him the way Montana cold does in late November, at elevation, not gradually but all at once, total and clarifying, the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose wacky on the first breath and makes every subsequent breath feel deliberate. He pulled his jacket tighter and reached back to clip Rex's lead, though he knew he didn't really need it. Rex walked beside him through the knee-deep snow with the efficient, ground-eating stride of an animal built for difficult terrain, scanning the property in every direction as they moved. The front steps had been sheltered enough by the entrance overhang that they were passable. Garrett found the lock. He brought out the brass key Edna had left in the envelope, small and old and cold between his fingers. A pine tree etched into its head. He fitted it to the lock. It turned. The door opened inward with a long, low sound, something between a groan and a sough, and released a breath of cold, stale air that carried inside it the smell of decades. Dust, aged wood, stone, something faintly floral that had long since lost its source. The smell of a place that had been sealed carefully against the world and had kept its seal. The entry hall was enormous. Garrett's flashlight beam cut through the darkness and found the ceiling first 20 feet up, crossed by carved beams disappearing into shadow. A chandelier hung in the center of the space, its crystals draped with the light webs of accumulated dust, still and quiet. White sheets covered the furniture, the shapes beneath them like sleeping figures. A grand staircase curved up from the center of the hall, its banister dark mahogany, its treads wide enough for three men to climb side by side. Rex walked in beside him and stopped. He stood in the center of the entry hall and turned his head slowly, reading the space with senses Garrett could not access. Then he stepped forward, nose close to the floor, and began to move toward the left side of the hall. His movement was not casual. It was the specific focused movement of a trained dog following a track. Garrett followed him. Rex led him past the covered furniture, past a side table that still held a ceramic bowl, past a mirror hung near the base of the stairs that reflected their shapes back at them in the dim beam of the flashlight. He led Garrett to a doorway at the far end of the hall, an arched frame that opened into another room. Garrett stopped before entering. He swept the flashlight across the floor. The dust lay thick and even on the hardwood, the kind of accumulation that takes years and is not disturbed lightly. But there, leading from the front door across the entry hall and toward the east corridor, was a trail. Not his, not Rex's, larger prints, heavier. Two separate tracks actually side by side, as though two people had walked through here together and not been careful about what they left behind. The tracks were not old. The dust at their edges had not yet resettled. The prints were clean-sided and defined, not softened by the slow drift and settling of undisturbed particles. Someone had been in this house within the last few hours. Rex looked back at Garrett and then at the doorway ahead. He was not alarmed. He was attentive. There was a difference, and Garrett had learned to read it. They entered the library. It was a long room with shelves built to the ceiling, crammed with books whose spines had faded to uniformity, browns and golds and muted greens, the colors of things preserved past their moment. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth filled with cold ash that had not been disturbed. A leather chair sat beside a reading table, a lamp with a green glass shade, a globe on a wooden stand. On the table, a journal lay open. Rex went to it, immediately pressing his nose near the cover before sitting and looking at Garrett the way he looked at him when he had found something and was waiting for acknowledgement. Garrett crossed the room and read. The journal was Edna's. The handwriting was the same as the letter. The entry was dated not by a single date, but by a year at the top of the page, and several years appeared across the page as he could see. He read the first full entry. 1977. They came to the house on a Tuesday. Preston's father and two lawyers I had never seen before. They had papers. They said my name was not on the deed as it should have been, that there had been a clerical error years ago that actually worked in my favor, and that correcting it was simply a matter of my signature. I was 27 years old, and I had learned enough by then to know that men who need your signature always want something they cannot take without it. I refused. They left. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the family attorney informing me that my claims to the Whitmore family property had been reviewed and found to be without merit, and that further contests would be both expensive and unsuccessful. I left the following month. I have not been back since. I did not leave because I was afraid. I left because I understood finally that the only inheritance worth having is the one you build yourself. He turned the page. 1994. The foundation is poured. I have hired a crew from Kalispell, none of them connected to anyone in the family. The house will take 2 years. I have paid in full. I own the land outright, 480 acres in my name alone, purchased over 6 years through a holding company that traces back to no one they would recognize. When it is finished, they will not know it exists. He turned another page. More entries. The voice consistent throughout. Precise. Unsentimental. The voice of a woman who had made her decisions and did not revisit them. And then a page near the back of the section he could see. March 16, 2001. Thomas died this morning, peacefully, the way he lived. He was the only one who stood beside me in 1977 when everyone else moved in the other direction. He used to say that a person's character is not what they do when they are being watched, but what they do when they are certain no one is looking. I have tried to live by that. I will continue to try. There is still work to do. Garrett closed the journal gently. He looked at Rex. The dog was still watching him. Patient, certain. There is still work to do, Garrett said. Rex rose and walked toward the doorway. He paused there and looked back over his shoulder with the amber eyes that Garrett had come to read as clearly as a person's face. Then he led Garrett back into the hall and to the base of the grand staircase where he stopped. He placed one paw on the bottom step. He waited. Garrett put his hand on the banister. The wood was cold and solid under his palm. The staircase rose into the dark above him, the upper landing invisible beyond the reach of his flashlight. Somewhere above the house settled against the wind, timber contracting in the cold, old stone shifting its weight, and underneath all of it, barely audible, a sound he should not have been able to hear, but did. A footstep, single, deliberate, from somewhere on the floor above. Rex's ears came forward. Garrett's jaw set. He began to climb. The stairs announced him with each step, the old wood groaning under his weight, no matter how carefully he placed his feet. He moved along the outer edge of the tread where the planks were nailed closer to the stringer and gave less. It helped, but didn't eliminate the sound. This house had not been designed for silence. The second-floor landing opened before him. A corridor stretched left and right, both directions lined with closed doors and framed photographs that he passed without stopping. The storm outside pressed against the windows at the corridor's end, the glass shuddering in its frames, and the sound of the wind up here was fuller, more present. Rex moved with him, close but independent, processing the space with his senses, while Garrett processed it with his training. There, the master bedroom door, at the far end of the right quarter. It stood slightly open, an inch of darkness visible through the gap. And Rex had gone to it without Garrett directing him the dog's nose. At the threshold, his tail held horizontal, the posture of concentrated attention. Garrett pushed the door open. The room was large. A bed draped in dusty fabric, dressers with tarnished handles, a fireplace with cold ash, a cracked portrait of a woman above the mantel, painted in the realistic style of someone who wanted the subject remembered accurately rather than flattered. The woman in the portrait had strong features and direct eyes and the air of someone who had learned that the world was survivable. He looked at her for a moment. Then Rex moved. The dog crossed the room to the far wall where a mirror stood. Not a small mirror. An enormous antique piece floor to ceiling framed in dark wood carved with mountains and pine trees. The glass was clouded with age but intact. It reflected the flashlight beam in a way that scattered the light across the room in fragments. Rex put his nose to the bottom edge of the frame and sniffed. Then he stepped back and put his paw against the lower corner. Then he did it again with more force, and again more urgent, his claws scraping the wood, his body leaning into it. Garrett crouched beside him. He ran his hand down the left edge of the mirror frame. There, a gap, thin as a blade but present. The mirror did not sit flush against the wall. He pressed his palm flat against the frame and pushed. The mirror moved, not a lot, but enough to feel the resistance of a mechanism behind it, something counterweighted, something built to hold, but to yield under the right pressure. He braced his shoulder against the frame and pushed harder. A metallic sound, deep, like a bolt disengaging. The mirror swung outward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a doorway, and behind the doorway, a staircase, narrow, steep, winding upward into complete darkness as the treads covered in dust, so thick they appeared carpeted. The air that drifted out from the opening was colder than the room and still, and carried inside it the smell of a sealed place, something between stone and old paper and time. But there was something else. The dust on the stairs had been disturbed. Not by them. There were marks in the gray surface that were not random. They were footprints, coming up, going up specifically. Someone had climbed these stairs in the recent past, and those prints did not come back down. Garrett stood in the opening and looked up into the dark. Rex pressed beside him, his shoulder against Garrett's knee, his nose lifted toward whatever was above. The house was not empty. Something waited above them in the dark. And Garrett Lowe, who had spent 12 years walking toward things that frightened him because the mission required it, put his foot on the first step and began to climb. The stairs were narrow enough that Garrett's shoulders nearly touched both walls as he climbed. The wood beneath his boots was old and dense, the kind of timber that does not rot because it was cut from trees that grew slowly and hard, and it held his weight without complaint, even as it announced every step with a sound like a low note struck on an instrument no one had played in years. He kept his flashlight angled upward, the beam catching nothing but the curve of the staircase, and the dust disturbed in the center of each tread where someone had passed before him. Rex climbed behind him, silent. The dog's paws found the edges of the treads the way they found everything, with the natural precision of an animal whose body understood terrain without having to be taught. The staircase made two turns before it ended. The door at the top was plain, unpainted wood with a simple iron latch dark with age. No lock. Garrett put his hand on the latch and held it for a moment listening. Nothing came from beyond the door except the sound of wind pressing at the roof above and the faint creak of the old structure absorbing it. He pressed the latch down and pushed. The door swung inward. The room that opened before him was large, far larger than the staircase had suggested. The ceiling rose to the roof line, the original beams exposed overhead and set into the slope of the roof. On the north and south sides were skylights, long panes of glass now opaque with snow and ice, admitting a pale, diffuse light that was not quite darkness and not quite anything else. It was the light of a winter night filtered through several inches of accumulated snow, and it turned the room into a world of blue-gray shapes and soft shadow. Garrett stood in the doorway and swept his flashlight slowly across the space. Easels, a dozen of them arranged throughout the room with no particular order, the kind of arrangement that develops organically when someone has worked in a space long enough that the tools migrate to where they are useful rather than where they are tidy. Canvases everywhere, stacked against the walls, hung from nails driven into the beams, set on the easels in various states of completion. Shelves along the east wall held jars and brushes and tubes of paint. Most of the tubes dried and cracked, the jars clouded with residue. A long work table ran beneath the east window, its surface stained with decades of color. This had been a working space, not a studio in the decorative sense, but a place where someone came every day and made things where the work was serious, and the mess was the evidence of that seriousness. Rex walked in past Garrett and began moving through the room with his nose low, reading the floor, reading the air between the easels, pausing at each canvas long enough to process it before moving on. Garrett watched him and let him work. Then the dog stopped. He stopped in front of a canvas on the north wall, a large piece framed and hung with the care given to finished work rather than works in progress. He sat in front of it and looked up at it, and then looked back at Garrett, and the look was the one that meant he had found what they were looking for, even if neither of them yet understood what that was. Garrett crossed the room. He brought the flashlight up and held it steady. The painting was figurative, two figures rendered with skill and with patience. A man standing in three-quarter view, wearing the utilities and load-bearing equipment of a Navy SEAL, the details of the uniform accurate enough that someone had either studied them closely or known them firsthand. The man's face was not fully resolved, the features suggested rather than stated, but the posture was specific, broad through the shoulders, a particular way of standing with the weight slightly forward, the readiness of a person whose body has been trained into a permanent state of preparation. Beside the man sat a German shepherd, also in three-quarter view, also specific, not a generic dog, but this dog, the particular architecture of this animal, the depth of the chest, the set of the ears, the way the head was held, with that combination of alertness and calm that Garrett had come to think of as Rex's native state. In the lower right corner of the fur, between the dog's shoulders, a small swirl of slightly darker coloring, a marking as specific as a fingerprint, Rex's marking, exactly as it appeared on the actual animal now sitting 3 feet away. Garrett stood very still. His flashlight did not move. In the lower left corner of the canvas, in the same precise hand as the journal and the letter and notation, the year, 2006. Garrett had been 20 years old in 2006. He had not yet completed Bud/S. He had not yet become a SEAL. Rex had not yet been born. There was no version of 2006 in which this painting could have been made from observation. He crouched and looked at the bottom of the frame. Numbers carved into the wood with something sharp and thin, a nail perhaps, or an engraving tool pressed in with care. 4 groups separated by spaces. 2019. He recognized the first 2 from the journal. He recognized 0316 from the entry about Thomas. He recognized 2019 from the letter, the year Edna had written that she completed her preparations. He stood. He looked at Rex. The dog looked back at him. How, Garrett said. It was not a question he expected an answer to. It was the only word he had for the moment. Rex rose and turned and walked toward the back of the room, toward the wardrobe that stood against the north wall, large and old, and built from the same dark wood as the banister on the main staircase. He went directly to it without investigation, without sniffing, as though he had already decided. He went to the right side of the wardrobe and pressed his nose to the wall beside it, and then turned and looked at Garrett. Garrett went to him. He put his hands on the side of the wardrobe and pulled. The piece was heavy, deeply heavy, and it had been sitting against this wall for long enough that it resisted the way furniture does when it has become part of the architecture. He got his feet set and pulled again harder, and the wardrobe scraped forward an inch, 2 inches, 3. The wall behind it was not wall, it was a door. Steel set flush into the framing, painted over once, and then again the paint cracked and peeling now, but the door beneath it solid and unchanged. In the center of the door, a combination lock, brass face, a dial with numbers around its circumference, 4 notches marked at intervals around the edge. 4 notches, 4 number groups. Garrett stood in front of the lock and thought about a woman he had never known, who had spent decades building this place and building this moment and trusting that the right person would eventually stand exactly where he was standing. He reached for the dial. He turned it to 1977. A click, deep and mechanical, felt as much as heard. He turned it to 1994. Another click, more resistance yielding. He turned it to 0316, moving through the 0, the 3, the 1, the 6, with deliberate care. A third click. The mechanism shifted. He could feel it changing in the lock itself, the internal architecture realigning. He turned it to 2019. The fourth click was different from the others. It was a release rather than a registration, and it was followed immediately by a sound. Garrett had not expected a deep pneumatic exhale, as though the door itself had been holding its breath for years and was now finally allowed to let it go. He grasped the lever handle and pulled. The door resisted. Not the resistance of a lock, but the resistance of a seal gaskets and pressure differentials and years of settled weight. He braced his back foot and pulled steadily, keeping the force even, and then the seal broke with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle, and the door swung outward, and the air that came through the opening hit him in the face. It was cold, colder than the room behind him, cold in the way of underground spaces of places insulated from the world's temperature changes by depth and mass and careful construction. And the smell of it was distinct, metal, old paper. And underneath both of those things, the faint chemical trace of controlled preservation, the smell of a place that had been maintained against time rather than simply left to it. Beyond the door was a short corridor, concrete walls, pipes along the ceiling sheathed in insulation, a single cage light fixture overhead, dark. The corridor descended slightly over its 10-foot length and ended at another door. Rex went in first. Garrett followed, ducking his head slightly for the low frame, and walked the corridor and stood before the second door. This one was different from the first. Heavier. The bolts in its frame were as thick as his thumb. The surface had been painted in a deep olive green that had held better than most paint does over decades because the temperature in here had never varied enough to cause the expansion and contraction that destroys coatings. A locking wheel sat at the center, the kind Garrett had seen on pressure doors in secured facilities, multiple bolts driven simultaneously by a single mechanism. He gripped the wheel and turned. It was stiff. Decades of disuse had thickened whatever lubrication remained in the mechanism, and for a moment he thought it would not move at all. He set his hands and applied steady force, the muscles in his forearms working, and then he felt the first movement, slate and grinding the wheel, turning a quarter inch, then a half, then beginning to move with increasing reluctance, overcome by increasing pressure. He turned it fully. The bolts withdrew with a series of sounds like the closing of a rifle action, each one distinct and final. He pulled the door. The vault beyond was lit. He had not expected that. But somewhere inside the space, either on a timer or triggered by the door mechanism, old fluorescent tubes had flickered to life, washing the room in the pale, flat light he associated with basements and government buildings and places where the business conducted was too serious for atmosphere. The light was not warm, but it was enough. Garrett stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. The room was approximately 30 feet square. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, each one labeled by decade on a tag holder, mounted at eye level. Standing cabinets, wall-mounted shelves, and at the center of the room, glass display cases, 4 of them arranged in a square, their contents catching the fluorescent light and returning it. Coins, stacked in labeled sleeves, gold from the color and the weight suggested by the thickness of the sleeves. Jewelry arranged on velvet. Documents in protective coverings, some of them bearing official seals that Garrett could read from where he stood. Stock certificates, bond documents, papers that were old enough to have that particular fragility of materials that have been handled carefully and stored correctly, but are nonetheless made of something that time works on. He walked to the nearest display case and looked without touching. He recognized some of the company names on the certificates, had seen them on buildings and product labels, and in business coverage that drifted through the background of everyday life. Early issue. He was not a financial expert, but he understood enough to know what early issue meant when the company in question was a name that had become part of the American economy in the decades since those certificates were printed. On a pedestal at the center of the four cases sat a leather binder closed a card tucked under its front cover with his name written on it in Edna's hand. He picked it up and opened it. The first page was a cover sheet. Whitmore Legacy Inventory. Final Assessment, 2023. He turned to the first section. She had organized it by category. Each line item listed the asset, the current estimated value, and a reference number that corresponded to a physical location within the vault. She had done this with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was a form of protection, that a well-documented truth is harder to dispute than an undocumented one. Bearer bonds, $87 million. Stock certificates, $112 million. Real estate holdings outside Montana documented through the holding company, $43 million. Art and jewelry, $18 million. Rare coins and metals, $15 million. At the bottom of the final column, a total, $265 million. Garrett read the number twice. Then he set the binder down carefully on the pedestal and stepped back and put his hands in his pockets and looked at the room around him with different eyes than he had been using 30 seconds before. Rex sat beside the pedestal and watched him. $265 million, built from nothing after 1977, by a woman who left with whatever she could carry and never asked anyone for anything and never told anyone what she was doing, and apparently never stopped doing it for the rest of her life. He thought about the room he rented in Laurel. He thought about the probate hearing this morning and the flat voice of the judge. The four words, "There is no designated inheritance," and Preston's carefully performed stillness across the aisle. He thought about his grandmother, Margaret Lowe, who had told him they will try to take what is not theirs. He opened the binder again and turned to the back pages. Edna had included a section labeled Legacy Project. It began with a list of charitable disbursements, years of them running back to the mid-1990s. Homeless shelters, veterans hospitals, counseling centers, a canine rehabilitation program that Garrett did not recognize by name, but whose described function matched exactly what he understood rehabilitation programs for service dogs to involve. The amounts were not small. Cumulatively, they represented a secondary fortune given away quietly over 3 decades. Then a section he had not expected. Program Sentinel, established 2018, a partnership, classified designation. He read the description slowly. It was a therapy initiative, a program pairing returning combat veterans with specifically bred and trained K-9 companions. The program had operated for 4 years before federal budget changes led to its quiet discontinuation. During those 4 years, it had placed dogs with 47 veterans across 11 states. Garrett turned the page. His own name appeared at the top of the next section. He stood very still and read. Edna had written in the same precise hand as everything else, a paragraph of explanation that was both the most clinical and the most devastating thing he had read in the vault. She wrote that she had become aware of Garrett Lowe through her ongoing monitoring of family members she considered potential heirs. She wrote that she had spent several years observing his service record through channels she did not specify. She wrote that in 2018, she had attached a single condition to her funding of Program Sentinel. That condition was this: the dog designated Unit R-17 would be assigned specifically to the squad that included Garrett Lowe. Garrett looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him. He had been assigned Rex by a program coordinator who told him the match was based on behavioral compatibility assessments. He had believed that because it was what he was told, and he had no reason to question it. The paperwork had come through channels he trusted. The assignment had felt random in the good way that some things feel random, the way a meal tastes better when you were not expecting it. It had not been random. He set the binder down again. He had questions that no one in this room could answer because the only person who could answer them had died 14 months ago and had apparently anticipated that these questions would be asked and decided that the answers she had written were sufficient. He was not sure they were sufficient, but they were what he had. Rex stood and walked to the corner of the vault farthest from the door. He went to the wall and put his nose to the junction where the wall met the floor and sniffed. Then he stepped back and looked at Garrett. Then he went back to the wall and pressed his paw against it, flat-palmed deliberately. Garrett crossed the room. The wall here was the same as the other wall's concrete block, painted age-stained. But Rex was not interested in the surface. He was interested in something at the base of the wall, and when Garrett crouched and brought his flashlight close, he saw it. A seam, almost invisible, running in a rectangle approximately 18 inches wide and 14 inches tall. Not a crack, a cut. Precise, intentional, the seam of a panel or a small door set flush into the concrete. No combination lock, no wheel, no keypad, a single keyhole, small round weighting. Garrett reached into his jacket and found the brass key from Edna's envelope, the key with the pine tree on its head. He had assumed the key was for the front door. The front door had used it, and then he had pocketed it again without thinking further. He fitted the key to the hole. It turned. The panel released inward a spring mechanism somewhere behind it and swung open on a hidden hinge to reveal a space approximately the size of a safe deposit box. Inside, set into the concrete, was a metal container sealed with a simple latch, no lock, no combination. Just the latch in Garrett's hands and whatever was inside. Before he could reach for it, Rex turned sharply toward the vault door. The hair along his spine came up, his ears pinned forward. His body went rigid in the way that Garrett knew meant a specific kind of alert, the kind Rex reserved not for smells or sounds at a distance, but for threats that were close and real and moving. Garrett killed the flashlight. The vault went dark except for the fluorescent tubes which he could not control from where he stood. He moved to the wall beside the door and pressed himself there, out of the direct line of the opening, and waited. From somewhere above, through the concrete and the steel and the floors of the old house, sound moved. Not the creak of old timber, not the pressing of wind, the sound of a door, of feet on a floor, of more than one person moving without particular concern for silence, because they had not yet understood that they were not alone. Rex came to Garrett's side and pressed against his leg and stayed there, his whole body a controlled tension. Garrett reached into his jacket pocket and found his phone. He opened an application he had prepared before leaving Billings that morning, because Ruth Bancroft had told him this might be necessary, because she had been careful without being specific in the way that people are careful when they are afraid of what they are asking someone to walk into. He connected to a number. He set the phone in his breast pocket with the microphone facing out. Then he waited. The sounds above grew more organized. Footsteps on the main staircase. The creak of the second-floor landing. Voices low, two of them, a third answering briefly. Movement through the master bedroom overhead. Then the mirror. He heard it swing. He heard the boots on the narrow staircase. He heard the studio door open and the sounds of a search furniture move, drawers checked. The wardrobe scraped forward, and the steel door he had left unlocked and ajar discovered, and the corridor entered. 4 sets of footsteps in the corridor. They came through the vault door without pausing. Preston Aldridge walked into the vault and stopped when his flashlight found Garrett standing against the wall. The moment stretched. Preston was not alone. Sylvia stood behind his left shoulder. Behind her, 2 men that Garrett did not recognize, broad and still, and carrying themselves with the specific, relaxed readiness of people who do physical work for other people without asking questions about the nature of that work. Preston swept his light around the vault and took in the filing cabinets, the display cases, the pedestal, the open binder. His jaw moved once. Then he looked back at Garrett. "You opened it," Preston said. His voice was conversational, the voice of a man who has decided that a situation is manageable and is working to make sure the other person believes the same. Garrett said nothing. Preston took a breath and arranged his features into something that was meant to communicate reason. "I want you to understand something," he said. "This does not have to be complicated. She was an old woman who lost perspective at the end. This family has a legitimate claim to everything in this room, and you know that." Garrett looked at him. Rex stood at Garrett's side, still, watching Preston with the amber eyes that missed nothing. Sign the transfer, Preston said. He nodded to one of the men behind him, who opened a briefcase and removed documents and set them on the nearest display case. $200,000 cash tonight in your truck before you leave the property. You walk away. We close this matter without courts or lawyers or anything that gets ugly. Garrett looked at the documents. He looked at Preston. He looked at Sylvia, who was watching him with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite uncertainty, but something between the two. Sign it, Sylvia said. She had the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed and had not yet had to confront the experience of not being. Rex moved. He stepped forward from Garrett's side, not charging, not lunging, but positioning himself between Garrett and the four people across the room, with the deliberate calm of an animal that has been trained to hold a line and knows exactly where that line is. His growl was low and continuous, the sound of a running engine, controlled and purposeful. The two hired men looked at the D and then at each other. One of them took a step toward the stairs. Rex turned his head, and the growl shifted, and the man stopped. Garrett said quietly and without heat, "The phone in my pocket has been connected to an attorney in Helena for the last several minutes. Everything said in this room since you came through that door has been transmitted and recorded. Every word, every offer." Preston's face did not change, but something behind it did. Garrett continued, "The live stream is still running. If you or either of those men make a physical move in this room, that becomes a separate legal matter from whatever you came here to accomplish. Armed trespass, conspiracy, any number of things that your attorneys will explain to you in detail if you don't already know." Preston stood very still. Sylvia's composure held for 3 more seconds and then cracked slightly at the edges. "You have no idea what you found," she said. "You don't even know what half of this is." Garrett said nothing. "You think this makes you set," she said, her voice sharpening now, the mask doing less work. "You think you just walk in here and inherit all of this, and that's the end of it. There are things about this estate and about that woman's intentions that you don't know. Things about how she operated. Things that courts will find very interesting." Preston put a hand on Sylvia's arm. She pulled away from it. "Ask yourself something," she said. "Ask yourself where that dog actually came from, Garrett. Ask yourself why an old woman you never met cared enough to arrange your whole life for you. Ask yourself what she wanted in return." The vault was quiet. Garrett looked at Rex. Rex did not look at Sylvia. Rex was looking at the two hired men, which was where the actual risk was, and he was managing that risk with the quiet professionalism that Garrett had relied on for 6 years in more serious circumstances than this. "Nothing is free," Sylvia said. Preston moved first. He stepped back toward the quarter door, and the two hired men read the movement and followed. Sylvia held her position for a moment longer, her eyes on Garrett, something working behind them that might have been calculation or might have been something more like frustration. Then she turned and followed her brother. Their footsteps receded through the corridor. Up the narrow stair, through the studio, through the house, Garrett heard the front door close. He heard faintly through the vault walls the engines of vehicles outside, and then those sounds faded too, swallowed by the storm. Rex relaxed. Not all the way, but enough. He came back to Garrett's side and sat and looked up at him. Garrett reached into his breast pocket and ended the call. He stood in the quiet vault with $265 million arranged around him on shelves and in cases and in labeled files, and he looked at the small, open panel in the wall and the container inside it with its simple latch and the brass key still in the lock. He thought about what Sylvia had said. Nothing is free. He crossed the room. He sat on the floor in front of the small panel, cross-legged the way he used to sit in briefing rooms waiting for the picture to become clear. Rex came and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, dog shoulder to human shoulder, and the warmth of the animal was the only warmth in the room. He reached into the panel and brought out the container and set it on his knee and looked at it for a long moment before he unlatched it. The latch released. The lid opened. Inside, placed on a folded cloth as though it were something fragile, was a letter. Cream-colored paper. Pine tree pressed into the wax of its seal. His name on the front in Edna's hand. Not Garrett, not Mr. Lowe. Just his name written the way she had written everything. Precisely. As though she had thought about each letter before committing it. He turned the letter over in his hands and looked at the seal. He did not open it yet. Outside, the storm that had been the worst in 50 years according to the radio reports was beginning finally to soften. The wind was still coming, but without the sustained violence of the earlier hours. The sky above the vault, above the studio, and the roof in the mountains was doing whatever winter skies do in Montana when a system moves through redistributing clouds, revealing stars in patches, letting the temperature drop to the kind of cold that is honest about what it is. Rex breathed steadily beside him. Garrett held the letter. The vault hummed with its old fluorescent light, and the filing cabinets stood in their rows, and the display cases held their coins and their history, and all of it waited. He broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages. He read it slowly, the way he had learned to read field intelligence, taking the words in order and not jumping ahead, not letting the mind race to conclusions before the information was complete. The fluorescent light was steady overhead. Rex breathed beside him. The storm pressed at the house above, quieter now, but still present, still reminding the world outside that this night was not finished. Edna had written Garrett, "If you have reached this letter, then you have done what I believed you capable of doing. You found the vault, you held your ground, and you are still here, which means you have not yet run from the weight of what you have found." That is the quality I was looking for, not courage in the dramatic sense. Men have courage for all kinds of reasons, some good and some not. What I was looking for was the willingness to stay present when staying is harder than leaving. You have demonstrated that willingness your entire adult life. I have watched you demonstrate it. I want to explain what that watching looked like because you deserve an honest accounting. He read on. After Thomas died in 2001, she wrote, "I had no children of my own and no intention of leaving what I had built to chance or to people who had not earned it. I began thinking carefully about what it would mean to choose an heir. Not by blood alone, not by proximity, by character. I spent several years examining the family tree, such as it was, looking for someone whose history demonstrated the qualities I valued. It took a long time. Most of what I found was disappointing. Then I found you. Your grandmother Margaret wrote to me twice after I left. The first letter came in 1979. I did not respond because I was not ready. The second came in 1989 when you were 3 years old. She wrote about your father leaving. She wrote about raising you herself. She wrote, "This boy is going to be something, Edna." I do not know what yet, but I can feel it, the way you can feel weather coming in off the mountains. I keep that letter still. Garrett stopped reading for a moment. He had not known that Margaret and Edna were in contact. He had not known his grandmother had written to this woman twice across a silence that the family called death and Edna called survival. He had not known that his grandmother had described him to someone at 3 years old with the kind of certainty that people usually only claim in hindsight. He read on. I tracked your enlistment through public records, she had written. I tracked your qualification through channels I will not detail, because the specifics are less important than the result. I want you to know that I did not insert myself into your career. I watched. There is a difference. What I saw was a man who performed his duty with extraordinary competence and who bore the cost of that competence without complaint and without self-destruction, which is not a small thing. Many men with your record have not made it through their 30s intact. You have. That is not luck. That is the result of a particular kind of internal architecture that is rare and worth preserving. He turned the page. She had written about Program Sentinel in more detail than the binder contained. She wrote that the program had been her idea originally, that she had brought it to a VA contact she had cultivated over years, that she had funded it anonymously through the holding company and asked for almost nothing in return except one condition. She wrote the dog, designated Unit R17, was bred from a line I had followed for 11 years. His sire was a dog I helped fund through a working dog preservation program in Colorado in 2009. I knew what R17 would be before he was born. I knew his temperament and his capability, and I knew that he would require a handler who matched him not in training but in character, because working dogs of his quality either fulfill their potential with the right person or they do not, and I was not willing to let him. Not. I designated your squad for the assignment in the program's 3rd year. The coordinator was told it was a behavioral compatibility decision supported by data. It was supported by data. I was the data. Garrett looked at Rex. The dog was watching him with the steady amber gaze that had been part of Garrett's daily existence for 6 years. He tried to think of a single morning in those 6 years when Rex had not been the first thing he was aware of. He could not think of one. She had written, "I want to be clear about something. I did not arrange Rex for you as a management tool. I arranged him for you because I understood that what you were going to carry home from your service was weight that a man cannot distribute alone, and I had watched you trying to carry it alone, and it concerned me, and I am not a sentimental woman. But I am an accurate one. And my accurate assessment was that Rex would be better for you than anything else I could have provided, including money. The money comes after. Rex came first. That was intentional." He read the final page. She had written, "Now, I will tell you about your grandmother." He sat up slightly. What Preston and his attorneys did not know when they submitted that will for probate is that I knew what they were planning before they finished planning it. I have maintained a relationship with a forensic document examiner in Missoula for the last 9 years, not because I anticipated fraud specifically, but because I understood the people involved and preparation costs less than remediation. When I learned of Margaret's decline in health in 2022, I contacted this examiner and asked him to obtain a copy of her existing will through legitimate channels and to maintain it for comparison. His name is Raymond Fuchs. Ruth Bancroft knows how to reach him. What he found when the new will appeared in probate proceedings is documented in the container you are holding. The signatures do not match. The notary stamp belongs to a notary who retired in 2019 and whose stamp was reported stolen in 2021. The paper stock, when tested, contains additives consistent with manufacture dates no earlier than 2022, despite the document's claimed execution date of 2020. These are not ambiguities. These are facts, and facts are what courts require. I built this estate on facts. I protected it with facts. I am leaving it to you with facts. The documentation in this container is sufficient, according to Raymond and according to Ruth, to have the probate decision reopened and the fraudulent will set aside. Margaret's original will, which she executed in 2017 with Ruth Bancroft as a witness, leaves her estate equally divided between her charitable designations and you. It is on file in Helena. She had written one final paragraph. "I am sorry I never spoke to you directly. I considered it several times and decided each time that it would complicate something that needed to remain uncomplicated. You needed to find this place on your own terms. You needed Rex to find it with you. You needed to understand by doing rather than by being told, because understanding by doing is the only kind that holds under pressure. I believe you understand now. I believe you are the person I thought you were. Build something with it, not for yourself alone. That is the condition I attach, the only one. Build something that is larger than what you were given. You will know what that looks like. You already do." Her name at the bottom, Edna Whitmore, and below that in smaller letters, March 16th, 2023, Thomas's anniversary. She had signed this on the same date every year that she considered worth marking. Garrett folded the letter and held it in both hands and sat in the vault for a while without moving. Rex stayed beside him. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere above the roof, the wind made one last pass through the mountains and then softened and fell away, and the silence that followed was the deep, particular silence of winter in Montana after a storm, when the world has been rearranged by weather and is waiting to find out what it looks like now. He did not cry. He was not built for crying in the demonstrative sense. But something in his chest moved and settled into a different position than it had occupied before, the way bones feel after a long carried tension finally releases. And he sat with that feeling for a few minutes and did not try to name it or manage it. Then he looked at Rex and said, "All right, boy." Rex stood immediately. They left the vault, securing the steel door behind them, and climbed back through the corridor and up the narrow stairs and through the studio and down the main staircase and out of the house into the cold Montana morning. The storm had passed. The sky above the North Ridge Mountains was the particular clear dark blue that only appears after serious weather has moved through, and the stars were visible in the western half of it, fading toward dawn. The snow on the ground was deep and clean and entirely undisturbed except for the tracks of the SUVs that had come and gone in the night, already beginning to soften at the edges as the temperature found its morning level. Garrett stood on the front steps of the Whitmore estate and looked at the mountains. Rex sat beside him and looked at them too. Then Garrett went to his truck and drove down the mountain to find a cell signal and call Ruth Bancroft. Ruth answered on the second ring despite the early hour, which told him she had been waiting. He explained what he had found in the small container, the documents, the forensic examiner, the notary stamp, the paper stock analysis. He described the letter. He gave her Raymond Fuchs's name, which she confirmed she already had. She said she would file an emergency motion to reopen the probate proceeding before the business day ended. She said she would contact Judge Prescott directly as the matter was time-sensitive, and Preston Aldridge's attorneys would begin moving assets the moment they understood what was in that vault. Garrett said they had already know there is a vault. Ruth said, then we move today. He drove back to Laurel and fed Rex and slept for 4 hours and woke to 17 missed calls, 3 from numbers he did not recognize, 1 from Preston, which he did not return, the rest from Ruth. He called Ruth. The emergency hearing had been granted for the following morning. Judge Carl Prescott presiding Billings Courthouse, 9 o'clock. Ruth had already spoken with Raymond Fuchs, who had confirmed his willingness to testify regarding the document analysis. She had filed the motion to have Margaret Lowe's original 2017 will entered into evidence and the 2020 document submitted for probate reviewed as potentially fraudulent. Preston's attorneys had filed 3 counter motions within 2 hours of receiving the notice. Garrett said, how does it look? Ruth said it looks the way the truth usually looks when it has good documentation behind it. He was in the courthouse at 8:45 the following morning. Rex was with him seated at his left side, his certification vest on his manner impeccably professional. The gallery was fuller than Garrett had expected. Word had moved through Billings the way it moves through small cities quietly and completely, and people who had known Margaret Lowe or known of Edna Whitmore or simply followed local matters had found their way to seats in the gallery rows. Preston arrived with 3 attorneys. He wore a different suit from the previous hearing, darker, a choice that may have been strategic or may simply have been the suit he reached for when the morning felt serious. Sylvia sat beside him, her composure restored to its surface, though Garrett noticed she did not look at him when he entered. Judge Carl Prescott entered at 9 o'clock precisely. Prescott was 64 years old. He had the build of a man who had spent his younger years doing physical work before the law redirected him, and he carried himself with the particular authority of someone who is not performing authority, but simply has it the way certain men do when they have spent long enough in positions of responsibility that the responsibility has become part of their posture. He had presided over Billings County proceedings for 21 years. He had known the Whitmore name for longer than that. He reviewed the filings without expression. He asked preliminary questions of both counsel in the flat, efficient manner of a man who understands that courtroom time is not a resource to be spent carelessly. He reviewed the motion to reopen probate. He reviewed the counter motions. He asked Ruth Bancroft to summarize the basis for the emergency filing. Ruth stood and spoke for 11 minutes. She was not dramatic. She was organized. She presented the forensic analysis of the 2020 document in the sequence of its findings, the signature comparison first, the notary stamp provenance, second, the paper stock dating third. She noted that the notary whose stamp appeared on the document had been retired for 3 years at the document's claimed execution date and had reported the stamp stolen. She submitted Raymond Fuchs's signed affidavit and offered his remote testimony, which Judge Prescott accepted. Fuchs appeared on a screen at the front of the courtroom and testified for 22 minutes in the careful, specific language of a man who has testified in document fraud cases many times and understands that precision is what distinguishes expert testimony from opinion. He used the phrase inconsistent with the claimed execution date 4 times. He used the phrase statistically improbable twice. He used the phrase consistent with fraudulent preparation once near the end, after he had laid the foundation carefully enough that the conclusion felt inevitable rather than asserted. Preston's lead attorney objected 7 times. Judge Prescott sustained 2 of the objections on procedural grounds and overruled the remaining 5. Then Ruth submitted the recording. She had prepared for this moment with the care that Edna would have approved of. The recording had been made on a device Edna had left with Ruth in a sealed container, with instructions that it be played in a legal proceeding if and only if the fraudulent will was challenged and the challenge reached a formal hearing. The recording had been authenticated by a digital forensics specialist Ruth had retained 3 months after Edna's death in anticipation of exactly this moment. Judge Prescott listened to the foundation testimony establishing the recording's authenticity. Then he nodded. The courtroom was quiet. Edna Whitmore's voice came through the speakers. It was not the voice of an old woman diminished by age. It was clear and measured and carried the same quality as her writing, the voice of a person who had decided what they meant to say and said it without ornament. She spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She began by stating her name, the date of the recording, and her legal address. She stated that she was of sound mind and that the recording was being made voluntarily and with awareness that it might be used in legal proceedings after her death. Then she spoke directly. She said, "I have reason to believe that after my death and after the death of my sister, Margaret Lowe, an attempt will be made to divert the estate of Northridge and the legitimate inheritance of Margaret's heir by falsifying testamentary documents. I have observed the behavior of Preston and Sylvia Aldridge over a period of many years, and I am not making this assessment lightly. I am placing this recording with my attorney Ruth Bancroft with instructions that it be used if the circumstances I anticipate come to pass. To whoever is hearing this in a courtroom, the documents submitted are not what they are claimed to be. The legitimate heir to both my estate and to Margaret Lowe's true testamentary wishes is Garrett Lowe. He is the person I have designated, and he is the person Margaret designated in the will she executed with full capacity in 2017. He is not a stranger to this family. He is its best member. Please give him what is his." The recording ended. The courtroom did not erupt. What happened instead was a particular quality of silence, the kind that comes when a room full of people has heard something that settles a matter so completely that there is nothing left to say. Preston's lead attorney leaned close to Preston and spoke quietly. Preston stared at the table in front of him. Sylvia had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at a point on the wall that did not contain anything. Judge Prescott took 40 minutes. He reviewed the filings and the testimony and the recording and the forensic analysis with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and when he returned to the bench, his expression was the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion he finds clear. He said the document submitted for probate in the estate of Margaret Lowe on October 14th of this year has been demonstrated by forensic evidence to be inconsistent in multiple material respects with the execution date and circumstances claimed. The court finds sufficient grounds to void the submitted document and to reinstate the testamentary instrument executed by Margaret Lowe in 2017, which has been submitted to this court and which this court accepts as the valid expression of her final wishes. He paused and looked at the room. He said, with respect to the estate of Edna Whitmore, the court finds that the designation of Garrett Lowe as sole heir is properly documented, properly witnessed, and properly executed, and that no credible legal challenge to that designation has been presented. Mr. Lowe's rights to the Northridge estate and its contents are affirmed in full. He said, with respect to the matter of the fraudulent document, the court is referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office for review. That office will determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. That determination is not this court's to make, but this court will note for the record that the evidence presented today is substantial. He closed the folder in front of him. Petition denied. Prior probate decision vacated. All rights affirmed as stated. This matter is adjourned. The room exhaled. Garrett sat still for a moment. Rex pressed against his leg. Ruth Bancroft turned from the front table and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has done her job and knows it. When Garrett walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, several people spoke to him. He answered them briefly and thanked them and moved through toward the exit. At the door, Preston Aldridge stepped into his path. Garrett stopped. Preston looked older than he had in the courtroom. Not the silver-templed distinction of the previous morning, but the actual age beneath it, the face of a man who has run a calculation his entire life and has just discovered that the calculation was wrong. Preston said, "I want you to know that we believe the document was legitimate. We were advised it was properly executed." Garrett looked at him. He said nothing. Preston said, "There may be facts we were not given by the people we relied on." Rex sat at Garrett's side and watched Preston with the amber eyes that did not assign meaning, but observed accurately. Garrett said, "The prosecutor's office will sort that out." He stepped around Preston and walked out into the cold Billings morning. The sky was the pale winter blue of a cleared system, sharp and clean. His truck was in the same lot as before. He opened the back door and Rex jumped in and settled. Garrett got behind the wheel and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Then he drove north. The months that followed moved in the way that purposeful months do, quickly and with the sense of ground being covered. Ruth filed the paperwork that formalized his control of the Northridge estate and its assets. Raymond Fuchs's analysis was passed to the county prosecutor, and 6 weeks after the hearing, Preston and Sylvia Aldridge were charged with document fraud and conspiracy in connection with the submission of the falsified will. Their attorneys were skilled, and the process would take time, but the evidence was what it was, and Ruth told Garrett that the outcome, while not guaranteed in its specifics, was not in serious doubt in its general direction. Garrett paid Ruth's fees and invested the remainder of the liquid assets with two institutions Ruth recommended and one that Garrett chose himself after research he did independently because he had not survived 12 years in a profession that required accurate, independent judgment by outsourcing his decisions to other people. The investments were conservative and the returns were not spectacular, and that was exactly what he wanted. He hired local contractors through a firm in Kalispell. He told them what he needed and let them work. The mansion required structural assessment first, which took 6 weeks, and revealed that Edna's original construction had been sound and that most of what needed doing was cosmetic and mechanical rather than foundational. The heating systems needed replacement. The electrical systems needed updating. The windows needed resealing. The roof needed work in 3 sections where ice dams had created problems over the years. Rex supervised all of it. This was not a metaphor. The dog moved through the renovation site every morning with the methodical attention he brought to everything, checking on workers, investigating new materials, occasionally alerting Garrett to things that turned out to be worth knowing. A gas line. The plumbers had not properly capped a load-bearing element in the east wing that the initial assessment had underestimated. Garrett had learned years ago not to dismiss Rex's alerts as coincidence. He had learned to follow them and find out what they meant. The studio on the 3rd floor he left largely as it was. He had the floors cleaned and the skylights repaired and the temperature regulated properly so that the canvases would not continue to deteriorate. He had a conservator come from Missoula to assess the paintings and advise on their preservation. The conservator was a woman in her 50s named Patricia who moved through the studio with the quiet reverence of someone in the presence of work they respect, and when she reached the large canvas on the north wall, the one with the seal and the ball and the year 2006 in the corner, she stood before it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Whoever painted this was serious. This is not amateur work. This is a person who spent decades at it." Garrett said she did. Patricia said the figure in the center. "The posture is very specific. You can feel that this is not an imagined person. She was painting someone she knew or knew of." Garrett said yes. He had the studio's temperature and humidity systems connected to a separate monitoring unit and checked the readings himself twice a week. The painting stayed on the wall where Edna had hung it. In the late spring, he drove to Helena and met with representatives of 3 veterans organizations whose work he had reviewed over the winter. He told them what he intended to do and asked them to tell him where the gaps were because he was not a social services professional, and he understood that good intentions applied without knowledge of actual need can miss the target entirely. The conversations were long and specific, and he came away from them with a clearer picture than he had gone in with. He came home and drew a plan on paper the way he had drawn operational plans, starting with the objective and working backward through the requirements. The objective was a functioning sanctuary for veterans dealing with the transition from service to civilian life, with particular attention to combat-related trauma, because that was the transition he understood from the inside. The requirements were space staff programming and ongoing funding, sufficient to operate without dependence on federal budget cycles or the preferences of administrators who might change. He had the space. He had the funding. He spent the summer building the rest. The 3rd floor became a residential wing with 8 private rooms, each designed to be quiet and simple, and to feel like a place a person could breathe. Not a hospital, not a facility, a place, the kind of place where the walls do not remind you that you need help, but simply provide you with privacy in which to do the work of recovery. The ground floor dining room became a common space with a kitchen that operated on a schedule, but could also be used independently at odd hours, because he had learned from his own years that need does not keep business hours, and hunger is sometimes the least complicated version of what is actually driving a man to the refrigerator at 3 in the morning. The library stayed the library. He added current titles alongside Edna's collection, shelving them together without marking which was which, because he thought the mixing was the point. That a man looking for something to read should not have to know the provenance of what he picks up, only whether it is worth his time. The K9 program, he named Sentinel after Edna's program, and he funded it as a standalone operation with its own staff and its own board independent of the sanctuary's other programming, because he had learned that animals serving a therapeutic function need their own serious infrastructure and not just the goodwill of people who think dogs are nice. Rex served as the program's first ambassador, which was a title Garrett invented because it was accurate. The dog moved through the sanctuary during operating hours with the natural authority of an animal who understands his environment and his purpose. And the veterans who came through responded to him the way Garrett had come to expect people who have been in serious situations to respond to an animal that has also been in serious situations. There was recognition. There was a kind of ease that did not require explanation. He named the sanctuary the Whitmore Low Veterans Retreat. He had considered other names and rejected them because the other names he considered either erased Edna or erased him, and both of them had paid for the right to have their name on something that would outlast them. The opening was held on the last Saturday of August. The morning was clear. The Timber Ridge Mountains in late August are the version of Montana that people who have not lived there imagine when they imagine it. The green, deep, and specific, the sky, the blue of something painted by someone who wanted to get it exactly right. The cottonwoods along the property's lower boundary were in their full summer state, the leaves catching light and turning it back as brightness. The meadow between the tree line and the mansion's front entrance had been mown and set with chairs for the occasion. People came from Billings and from Helena, and from Kalispell, and from smaller towns whose names Garrett knew from maps rather than from visits. Veterans in various states of physical and emotional repair, family members of veterans, people from the organizations he had consulted, contractors who had worked on the building and wanted to see what it had become. Neighbors from properties along the county route who had watched the trucks going up and down the mountain road for months and were curious in the way of people who live far enough from others that a new neighbor is an event. Ruth Bancroft came. She stood near the back of the gathering in her wool coat, the same one she had worn outside the courthouse in November, and she watched the proceedings with the expression of someone witnessing the completion of a project they had been part of for a very long time. Judge Prescott came. He stood near the front and nodded at Garrett when their eyes met. Garrett spoke from the front steps of the mansion, with Rex seated at his left side. He was not a natural speaker in the public sense. He had no instinct for performance and no interest in developing one. He stood at the front of that gathering and spoke the way he had always communicated when communication mattered plainly and with attention to accuracy. He said, "I want to tell you what this place is and what it is not. It is not a monument. It is not a statement about anything except the belief that the people who carry the hardest things deserve a place to set them down for a while and figure out what comes next. That is all it is. A place. A functioning place with a roof and a kitchen and people who know what they are doing and an animal who will find you wherever you are in the building and sit with you without requiring anything from you in return." He paused. He said, "I did not build this. A woman I never met built it. She spent 50 years building it. I am the person she trusted to finish what she started, and I want to honor that trust by being accurate about it. Her name is on the door. That is where it belongs." He said, "If you are here because you need this place, you are welcome. If you are here because you wanted to see what became of Edna Whitmore's estate, now you know. If you are here because you knew Margaret Lowe, I want to tell you that she would have had opinions about the catering, but would have approved of the general direction." A few people laughed. The laughter was the warm kind, the kind that comes when humor acknowledges something true. After the remarks, the afternoon moved into the relaxed motion of a gathering that has no agenda beyond itself. People toured the building in groups and individually. The kitchen produced food. Veterans found corners and chairs and conversations, sometimes with each other and sometimes with the counseling staff Garrett had hired, and sometimes just with Rex, who moved through the rooms and the outdoor spaces with the patient availability of an animal who has decided that his purpose is to be present and who executes that purpose without drama. In the late afternoon, Garrett walked the perimeter of the property alone. He went along the fence line at the property's southern edge, where the meadow gave way to old-growth timber and the temperature dropped noticeably in the shade. He walked without a destination, the way he had rarely allowed himself to walk in the years between leaving the service and finding himself standing in a parking lot in November, holding a letter with a pine tree pressed into the wax of its seal. He had not been good at purposeless walking. He had been good at moving toward objectives and at stillness, when stillness was required. But the middle state, the state of simply existing in a place without a task attached, had always felt to him like a gap he did not know how to fill. Rex walked beside him. They came to a place where the fence met an old stone wall that predated the fence by at least a generation, the stones stacked in the dry method with no mortar, held by their own weight, and the careful judgment of whoever had placed them. The wall ran along the property's western boundary and turned north toward the mountains, and where it turned there was a gap, not a formal gate, but a deliberate opening, the stones on each side of it worn smooth by decades of passage. Garrett stopped at the gap and looked through it at the mountain slope rising beyond. He thought about Edna standing in this spot. He did not know if she had. He had no way of knowing. But the wall had been built on her property during her time, and the gap was deliberate, and this seemed like the kind of view a person would return to when they needed to remember the scale of things. The mountains in late afternoon light are a different range from the mountains in the morning. The shadows are longer, and the definition is sharper, and the color moves through a range that has no equivalent in anything manufactured. Garrett had grown up in Montana and had spent 12 years in terrain that ranged from desert to river valley to high mountain, and he had come to understand that landscape works on a person differently depending on the interior state they bring to it. The same mountain looks different to a man carrying grief than it does to a man carrying nothing. He was not sure what he was carrying tonight. Less than before he thought. Differently arranged, certainly. The things that had been shapeless and heavy for years had found their way into containers he could manage, not because the weight had changed, but because he understood now what the weight was and where it came from and what it was for. He heard Rex behind him and turned. The dog had not followed him to the gap. He was standing 15 feet back, ears forward, watching Garrett with the amber eyes. Waiting in the way he always waited, without impatience, without demand, with a simple offering of his presence and his attention and whatever it is that dogs provide that cannot be accurately named but is immediately recognizable to anyone who has received it. Garrett walked back to him. He crouched down and put his hands on either side of Rex's face the way he had done 100 times in the field after a difficult operation. The gesture that meant we are here and we are whole and whatever just happened is behind us now. Rex leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Garrett's. They stayed that way for a moment. Then Garrett stood. He took the letter from his jacket pocket, the last one, Edna's final page, which he had been carrying since the vault, and which he had read enough times that the fold marks were beginning to soften. He read the last line one more time, in the afternoon light, the same line he had read in the concrete vault in the blue fluorescent cold of a November night that felt both recent and very far away. She had written, "I built all of this alone, but I always knew you would not have to." He folded the letter back along its creases and returned it to his pocket. Behind him on the slope above the mansion, the lights in the windows had come on as the afternoon faded, and the building that had stood dark and sealed for years was lit from within warm and inhabited the sound of people moving through it, carrying faintly down the hill on the still evening air. The mountains held their light a little longer than the valley below, the way they always do, as though they are not quite ready to surrender the day. The first stars appeared in the eastern sky above the ridgeline, faint and certain. Rex walked beside him back up the slope toward the sanctuary, toward the light in the windows, toward the sound of people who had come here because they needed what this place was built to give. Garrett Lowe walked up the hill in the Montana evening, with his dog beside him, and the letter folded in his pocket, and the mountains behind him, holding the last of the light, and he did not look back.